During the 19th and early 20th centuries, the idea of home to society's poorest families could be precarious and transient. Hundreds of thousands of children spent time in one of the many institutions established to provide shelter for those in need. Building on the excellent work of historians such as Jane Hamlet, I have examined how ideas of home were reproduced in these institutions in spatial, architectural and material terms, and how various practices of relating to authority and comfort might create an artificial sense of home for inhabitants. My paper today takes my research in new directions to consider how ideas of home and homemaking practices were understood by British child migrants in Canada between 1870 and 1920. My research today turns to the idea of home in emotional terms and argues that landscape and natural environment played a central role in their feelings, ideas and imaginings of home. First, I explore what migrants had to say about arriving and settling in Canada, taking experiences of homesickness to consider how they recalled and remembered home. Second, I look briefly at how institutions sought to manage these difficult feelings before examining how migrants articulated their ambitions and desires about making a home. The emigration of over 100,000 children to different parts of the empire reflected growing anxieties about urban degeneration and the desire for a return to the rural, which also promoted the idea that individuals could be moulded and shaped by their environment. Major welfare agencies drew on this idea to justify their processes of children's rescue and removal from seemingly dangerous homes and families and their installation in supposedly revitalizing environments. Although marketed as a fresh start and a route to increased prosperity and social mobility, many children were simply sources of cheap labor for both exploitative employers and for the nation's empire building projects. Children's knowledge about the imperial environment prior to their arrival during the final decades of the century was shaped by representations of colonial life in the periodical press. The way that the natural world and environment was written about changed over the course of the century. In the early decades of the 19th century, Canada was characterized as offering little of the civilized and cultivated beauty of the English landscape, and instead, it promoted the idea that settlers had battled, tamed, and overcome nature and Indigenous people. Such representations perpetuated forms of environmental racism and ecological imperialism, as historian Michelle Smith has argued. But by the later 19th century, literature described Canada as rivaling England in several ways, from its material provisions to its landscapes. The roughness of daily life that hampered the early settlers had given way to an ideal of humble log houses and cosy homesteads, replete with luxuries that were nearly as cheap as in England. While the climate could be extreme, guidebooks targeting potential migrants emphasised the superiority of the Canadian climate over England, which suffered with prolonged dampness and dreary fog. Juvenile literature, even by the later 19th century, however, continued to characterise the Canadian environment as exotic and exciting, with regular heroic tales about battles with wildlife and a fascination with the country's Indigenous population. Of course, the differences between literary representations and what many migrants would have encountered was vast, as other historians have indicated. Like other colonial settlers, children corresponded in depth about their new environments. The climate, landscape, soil, vegetation, and wildlife all took centre stage. Writing about their surroundings helped make them familiar and understandable, not only for the benefit of the letter's recipient, but also for the authors, who continually sought to make sense of their experiences. This centrality of landscape and environment is unsurprising. Many children were transported from industrial urbanscapes to rural settings. Moreover, many immigrants were trained and prepared for agricultural work by care agencies prior to their departure, so it's expected that these letters tend to focus on the environmental aspects of their work. Nevertheless, these narratives are revealing for their emotive content and in highlighting their understandings of imperial homemaking. The arrival in Canada must have made a profound impact on most children. Many young people recounted their feelings and experiences often years after this moment. George Tucker emigrated from Barnardo's to Toronto in April 1888, age 16. 11 years later, he wrote to the editor of Ups and Downs, the periodical produced by the agency for its community of migrants, to recount his feelings. He stated, "The country was like a desert to me, nothing to be seen but deep snow, and a very stormy day it was to me. I was a perfect stranger in a strange country." In the first of several letters written by Thomas Fragel in January 1899, the 12-year-old wrote about his expectations of his new home. He said, "Before I left England, I was under the impression I was coming to a wild, desolate country inhabited by a few white people and Indians." 3 years after George Hearne emigrated, he wrote, stating, "When I first came to Canada, everything looked so strange and I did not know very well what to think of it the first week or two. I felt pretty lonely and homesick and wished I was back in England." These letters clearly connect the unfamiliar sights of the environment with a sense of disorientation, loneliness, and homesickness. For some children, a feeling of homesickness was tied directly to the sensory differences they experienced in the country. The sights, smells, sounds, and daily modes of life were all remarkably different to what they had been used to in Britain. Feelings of discontent and of being ill at ease in the new world abounded, and these sentiments were only exacerbated by the isolation experienced in rural settings, a lack of freedom, and the strict employers that some young people encountered. Age also played a role in how youths made sense of their relocation. While younger migrants may have been more adaptable to settling into a new life, others lacked the emotional maturity, knowledge, and life experience to acclimatise to their new surroundings without great effort. As historian Susan Matt has shown, the condition of homesickness was widely acknowledged to be a serious condition prior to the 20th century, often brought about by the trauma associated with migration, which was rarely an easy or natural process. Various constituents of home have been yearned for by migrants. Throughout history, migrants have been homesick for the domestic coziness of family homes, for their bonds with family and friends, for the cities, towns, and villages they were familiar with. But child migrants often had a more complicated history and experience of home and family. Some had little semblance of what we would imagine to be a comfortable home life, while others had knotty, problematic relationships with family. Despite these difficulties, migrants were no different to other colonial settlers across the empire. Multitudes of letters were sent back to institutions to articulate their feelings of homesickness. In response, staff were tasked with imparting regular advice on how best to manage this emotion. Homesickness, the institution stated, was not an unhealthy sign, nor did it reflect a discontented mind. Several articles acknowledged the connection between homesickness and landscape, specifically migrants' nostalgia for British nature, which haunted their recollections and visions of the old country. One article here stated they see England in her May Day beauty, which no doubt is difficult to match in any other part of the earth. However natural this rural nostalgia might be, the periodical warned that it was distance that lent enchantment to the view. The article swiftly dismantled this reverie of the sublime British pastoral, reminding readers that their place in the world was in the urban industrial centres. If they were to return, they would find themselves in the hot and dusty city, where the fight for bread is bitter and incessant, where employment, difficult at all times to obtain, even when once secured, gives barely sufficient to pay the rental for the little box called by compliment a room, and to purchase the food from day to day necessary to keep the soul and body together. Articles such as this allowed the institution to mediate migrants' feelings and experiences through the validation of some emotions and the suppression of less desirable feelings like homesickness, grief, and loneliness. Another popular method of helping youths to manage and regulate feelings of homesickness was to encourage them to find appreciation for and forge positive emotions with their new world. In 1899, Ups and Downs announced a competition for the best account written by a migrant on the subject, Why I Like to Live in Canada. 45 entries were received and 7 of the best were reprinted in the magazine for the readers to decide the winner. One characteristic shared by all 7 was that these letters drew on the senses to describe the Canadian countryside and to convey the author's wonder and fascination about their local environments. In their gushing praise about the Canadian landscape, a telling difference between the old world and the new, these letters suggest that migrants' ideas and feelings about home were intimately bound up with how they encountered and experienced the natural environment. Henry wrote, "I like to work in the fields, for it is much more pleasanter than it is working in the dull city of London. It is more pleasant to see the rich fields of grain than it is to see the busy street and the crowds of working men rushing to their work. I like to work in the harvest fields and to hear the sweet song of the birds as they fly to and fro, and to listen to the hum of the binder as it is cutting down the grain and making it into sheaves." These letters are typical of many others. They detailed the author's enthusiasm and love for the natural scenery of their adopted countries and indicated that migrants placed value on various sensorial and material features of everyday life. The ability to, as Herbert Ward stated, eat a good meal 3 times a day was enough for him to enjoy his new home. Others acknowledged that their greatest blessings were having warm clothing, comfort and shelter, which had been hard to find in England. William Wilmot asked, "What does one care when he gets lots of good, substantial food and some good warm clothes? How hard it freezes." What many letters suggested too were migrants' dreams and ambitions of being independent and making a home and family of their own. Their ability to live more comfortably than their parents, whose hardship had resulted in the breakdown of the family unit, would have no doubt been a dream for some. For Lydia Rowe, who migrated in 1886, a devoted husband, 2 children, and her own farm was enough for her to feel very happy and contented, though she often reminisced fondly about her old institutional home. Meanwhile, William Eaton sent a letter in 1903 that coolly stated, "When I leave here, if I ever do, I am going to be a farmer. As soon as I can get a place, I'm going to put some fine buildings on it so that my master and mistress can come and visit. I don't think I could get into the hands of better people in the Northwest. Don't think that I am telling any lies, because I am not. I guess I will make my home in Canada. I won't go back to England again. You can get lots to eat out here. I did not think it was so good out here, but I've found it out now. I would rather be out in the fields ploughing than in the streets selling newspapers. You get lots of fresh air in the fields. You ain't breathing smoke all the time. You bet the farm is the place for me, not the streets. I think I will quit now. My fingers are getting tired." For others, it took longer, but time nevertheless eventually gave way to feeling at home. And here I've included a couple of excerpts. The second letter, written by Herbert Panting, stated, "I never thought when I first came here that I would stop in my place so long. It seemed to me such a wild country and such hard work, and I used to be dead tired. And I would always think, just wait till I get my $100, and then if I don't go back to the old country, my name isn't what it is. But as the years went by, I got used to it. I would not go back to the old country to live for anything now, though of course I shall always have fond recollections of the dear old land, and perhaps sometime in the future I shall go there for a visit, but nothing else." Of course, not all migrants felt such nostalgia and yearning for the British natural environment. For most, relationships with family and friends constituted their ideas and feelings of home. Maintaining connections at home was also an antidote to homesickness. While controversial practices adopted by welfare agencies ensured that some migrants never saw or heard from relatives again, evidence shows that many migrants maintained connections from afar. Moreover, the institution encouraged young people to keep in touch with their supposedly problematic family members. A feature printed in the 1900 issue of Ups and Downs reminded youths of their obligations to keep in touch with parents and advised readers thus: "Boys, whatever else you neglect, whomsoever else you forget, surely think of your mother. Mother, the sweetest, the homeliest word in the language, it is written on every boy's heart. Woe betide you if it's blotted out." Acknowledging the strength of family bonds, Bernardo's introduced a programme that helped migrants return to England for a holiday, as well as a scheme that helped them facilitate the migration of family members to join them. Rosina and Sarah Wagner both migrated in 1897 to join their brother John, who had migrated a few years earlier. They saved enough money between them to bring their mother out to Canada in 1904, having not seen her by that point for several years. Rosina wrote to Bernardo's later that year to report that her mother had found employment in a neighbouring town and liked Canada so well she did not wish to return home. None of the family returned to England to live permanently. So to conclude, this paper has very briefly highlighted the different ways that some child migrants approach the notion of home and homemaking in the British Empire. It does not seek to overturn the dominant narrative that children's migration was controversial, inhumane, and that young people experienced extreme hardship and trauma. Its focus is not on evaluating these programmes, but instead on centering the child and their voice within research to listen to and understand more carefully what they saw, sensed, and experienced, which was varied, uneven, and often changing. In doing so, it demonstrates the shifting meanings they gave to their surroundings, experiences, and the idea of home, both old and new. Their letters revealed that creating a home and feeling at home were distinct, and there could be gradual and challenging processes. But in particular, the letters demonstrate the emotive power of the natural world. Feelings of home could be intimately bound up with their visions, understandings, and engagements with the natural environment. Importantly too, the papers laid out a case for using child migration sources, particularly letters, in new ways to tell different stories about the world at the time. By bringing the emotions and the natural environment together in dialogue when thinking about ideas of home, they offer the possibility of contributing to broader cultural and social histories of migration and empire in new ways. Stories of colonial settling that are quite distinct from those told from the viewpoint of British middle-class families who are transnationally mobile. There's a need too to examine these sources with greater consideration to ideas of identity, national culture, colonialism, and dispossession, to better understand what Englishness and empire building meant in the minds of child migrants, and how nostalgic sentiment for the rural was bound up with ideas of nationalism, home, modernity, and class. Thank you.